All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. When I lectured yesterday, Monday, September 25th, 2017, on Chapter 13 of our textbook, Murock's ASP.NET 4.6 Web Programming with C# 2015, 6th edition, I forgot to turn the tape back on after the break. Now, we actually picked it up on page, I don't know, it must have been about 468. Yeah. But I'm going to jump back to 462 and spend a little bit more time. So I don't know how long this lecture is going to last, but this is what I'm going to do right now. So this particular section talks about a data list. And as it says, it displays items from a repeating data source such as a table. So it is a way for you to show the contents of a table. You can show the entire contents of a table, or by doing a select star basically, or you can do a select and just add certain fields, and or you can have certain fields and only certain records if you put where criteria on there. So as it says, we learn how the data list control works. We learn how to create the templates that define a data list control, and learn how to format a data list control. All right. And the author says you can also use a repeater control, but they don't really talk about it anymore in there. So let's just hold off on that. That's fine. So how does the data list control work? So the figure on the next page that we'll talk about, in fact, let's go there and then we'll jump back again. This figure right here shows list data based on a data list control. And you can see there are two fields here. There is a name and there is a price. All right. So, as it says, it shows a simple data list that consists of two columns of data. To create a list like this, you use the data source ID property of the data list. So what the data source ID property does is it binds the control to the data source. In other words, it says that rather than us manually inputting that data, we're going to be getting it from a database. All right. After you do that, you define one or more of what are known as templates. All right. At a minimum, you'll have two templates, one that defines the header information and one that defines all of the content. All right. So as it says there, in the ASPX code shown in the figure, you see the data source is a data source named SQL Datasource 2. Now, one place where the author in here falls a little bit short, in my humble opinion, is that he talked earlier in the book about giving things good names, and now he's kind of going away from that. All right. Says you can also see that a single item template was used to create this list. This template includes two label controls bound to the name and the unit price. And as it says, we'll learn how to do this in this chapter, and in Chapter 18, which is the last chapter in the database section. As he says here, you'll learn how to make this kind of binding easier by using what's called model binding. So to do this and to get these two fields that we have in here, we set up the data list. Again, as always, at a minimum, really all our ASP.NET controls need an ID and a run at, but also at a minimum, the data list also needs a data source that it can bind to. All right, so we're binding it to this SQL data source, which later on we're going to have to basically set up. And when we set it up, we will basically set that up so that there is some kind of an SQL statement with it. Now on here, you normally have a header template, then an item template. We don't have headings here, so we only have an item template. So we're telling it the name, run at equal server, and this says go out to the database and find every name that's in there and put it right here. Put it in that first column. Then it says go out and for every single record we have in there, put the unit price after it and format it. That's the zero there means that it's this field 0, format it in currency. So again, we have three components: the ID, the run at, which we're very familiar with, and the data source ID. And this is a term you have to start to get used to. It's the ID that you want to bind the data list to. Bind literally means, or for lack of better words, the data source is almost always going to be a database. but we're telling it that rather than manually inputting the data, we're getting it from someplace else. So the author says here a data list is a list of items from the data source that it's bound to, okay? To define the information, you create one or more templates. Again, typically you'll have at least a header template and an item template, but I believe for brevity here, the author just put in the item template. To display the data from a column, you add a control to a template and then bind that control. So we have two controls here. We have two labels. All right, we're binding the data source to that data list, and that data source is going to hold an item template with two ASP.NET controls. It says you can use the data list for edit operations, but typically it's used for display. As we go on in Chapter 14, we'll talk about the grid view, and in 15, 16, 17, etc., we'll go into the details view, the form view, and the list view. Good, bad, or indifferent, one of the things that ASP.NET gives you is a lot of different ways of doing the same thing. All right, so next, starting on page 464, talks about how to define the templates for a data list. All right, it says the table in this figure lists the templates you're most likely to use. I already mentioned the header and the item. The item would be the only one that's mandatory, and you saw that in the previous example. All right, in the one that we'll do at the end of the chapter, we will have both a header and we'll have an item. All right. If you have things that you want displayed after the last item, you put them in a footer. Maybe you'd want to count, maybe you'd want a message that it was at the end, etc. If you want to use zebra striping, you use an alternating item template. And you can have a separator to put things between each one of your items. So, that's those. All right. It says, although you can create templates that let the user select and edit items in the list, you're not likely to do that. Again, instead, you're going to use the stuff we'll talk about in later chapters. The only template that's required, as mentioned, is the item template. The item template defines how each item is displayed. All right. As it says, typically you'll use a header template to create headings that are displayed in the first row of the data list. To define the templates, you'll work in what's called template editing mode. All right. And when you're in template editing mode, you're going to be using this stuff. It's a little ugly. It's a little bulky to work with. All right. I don't particularly like to. That's why I put in the code myself. All right. If a data list contains two or more columns, you can place the text and controls within a table. That way you can set the width. So in other words, you're doing it for formatting reasons. All right. In the example, the user set the widths of the corresponding columns in the item template and the header template to be the same values. Note, when you're using Bootstrap, you don't have to place the contents of each in a table to set the column widths. Rather, you can assign the Bootstrap column classes to the text or control in each column. You can also set the Bootstrap table classes. All right. It says, before I go on, you should realize that you use templates to define the content of a data list, the content and not the appearance. We'll look at that in just a bit. So here's how you do an item template. Here's how you do a header template. These are the common templates. And here's a little bit more rehash of what I just gave you on the bottom of the page. All right. So we just said that when you do this, it shows the content but not how to format them. So how do you format them? That's next on pages 466 and 467. All right, so on pages 466 and 467, all right, we talk about how to format the data list. So the author says you can use one of the techniques presented in this figure. That figure is what's shown here. Notice the format page. You can set color, etc. There's a lot of things that you can set for what's done in here. All right, now we're talking aesthetic type of values. So you can set the header, the footer, the items, the separators, all the major players. All right, the elements are shown down below that. So, again, if you're using Bootstrap, the best way to format the list is to use the Bootstrap classes for working with tables. For instance, you can use the table and the table striped. Then if you do that, if you put everything in a table and you use the table stripe class, then you don't have to worry about that alternating rows. All right. Says if you want more on tables, you can refer back to 10.4 in page chapter 10. I'm not going to do that right now. You can also use other techniques presented in this figure to format a data list. You can use these techniques rather than bootstrap classes or in addition to the bootstrap classes. Note the easiest way to format a data list is to use the auto format dialog box. When you use the auto format dialog box, and I don't even remember where it is here, it might be under format. Let's see if it tells us. This dialog box lets you use one of the 17 predefined schemes that use different combinations of colors and borders for the items of a data list. Another way is to use the format page, and that's what we have on the next figure here, which lets you set the stuff accordingly. So both the auto format, which isn't shown directly, and the properties dialog boxes provide ways to format the list. But you can also format directly via the properties window. We've seen this kind of thing before. All right. It says this figure also presents the 5 style elements you're most likely to use. So you can do it this way with the format page of the properties dialog box. All right. You can do it using one of the header styles, and I believe if you use the header styles, I could be wrong here, but I believe that when you use the different styles, if I bring this up, so if I wanted to format, let's say here, and I click here, and I go to configure data source, and I run all my way through it. No, that's not there. Builder, there's the auto format. Okay, that's what I was looking for. So you can do that and set things up. You don't have as much control. You have 17 things to choose from, but you can't typically, I think you actually can go back in. It's going to generate CSS for you, and I believe then you can go back in and modify that CSS. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. All right, 468, how to use data binding. Once you've configured a data source control, you can and should bind it to a web form to automatically display. Literally 99.999% of the time, it's going to be this, the binding is going to be done so that you can bring up database information. All right? Data source, database. All right? It says in the following topics, you will learn how to bind a list control to a data source and how to bind controls within the templates of another control like a data list control. Notice one is a list control and one is a data list control. When you see things that are prefaced with data, they are working with data sources. By and large, again, they are going to be working with databases. All right, so the figure 1314 that's on page 469 shows how to bind a list control to a database. It says to do this, you use the 3 properties that are shown in the figure: the data source, the data field, and the data value. All right, or data text field and data value field. All right, value. All right. So this is the control you're binding to. This is the field that you want to show. This is the field from the database from which you're getting the information. Now, I was general there, but that's pretty much the way it is. All right. So when you set this up, you're going to be setting up your ID you run at, an auto postback typically, a data source, and the data text field, and the data value field. Take a minute to read that. Again, I know I sound like a broken record, but for you to succeed in this and to understand what's going on, you must read these chapters. You can bind any controls that inherits from the list control class, including the list box, drop-down list, checkbox list, and radio button list. All right. You can use the data source configuration wizard to select these and work from there, or you can write it in code, which is what I did. Next, on 470 and 471, how to bind the controls in a template. This figure shows how you can bind the controls in a template to columns of a data source. As mentioned right there. Sorry about that. I'm doing great for time. All right. This technique can be used with any control that uses templates and specifies a data source. To bind a control, it says you use the data bindings dialog box. All right. There it is. From this dialog box, you can select the field binding option, then select the field you want to bind to. If you want to format the bound data, you can also select the format from the second drop-down list. Right there. There's the field. All right, they even show you an example when you go through it. By default, you bind the text property of a control so the bound data is displayed in the control. But you might want to bind to something else. For example, enabled or visible, which isn't going to be done often. I don't know if we're going to do that at all. As you make selections in the data bindings dialog box, Visual Studio generates these eval methods for you automatically. It says you can see the syntax of the eval method here. All right? And that's shown right down here. Again, in English, this is saying, go to the database, grab me the name, and put it here with what I'm bound to. Grab the unit price, do it here with what I'm bound to. All right, so it'll do the eval and it'll do the binding basically for you. Although the drop-down lists make it easy to create a data binding expression, you can customize it as well if you want to do that. Unlike the eval method, which provides only for displaying bound data, the bind method provides both for displaying and updating. It's known as two-way binding. We won't talk about that in this chapter, but we'll look up at it in the next chapter. Everything we do in Chapter 13 here is based off of the select command, and you know as well as I do that you cannot change data based off of the select command. Again, if you need more, page 471 on the bottom of the page. All right? The next section goes through this product list application. As it says, it's a simple one-page app that demonstrates the use of two different data sources. All right, the drop-down list at the top of the page, which has our category, it's bound to the first data source. It gets the categories for the products. Then the second one, all right, is bound to the data list control. That's going to give us the information, the ID, the product, the unit price, and the on hand. All right. Since this application relies entirely on the data binding that's established in the Web Forms Designer, there's no code. Although it seems like a simple app, there's a lot you can do with it. All right. Even complicated apps that insert, update, and delete can often be written with little or no code. Not very often with no code, because almost always you're going to want to do either customization or you're going to want to check for the case. How are you going to handle it if there was a wrong query or no data or whatever? As it says here, that's not to say that most ASP.NET database apps are code-free. In the next 3 chapters, we're going to be adding more and more code as we go on. So this is the way it looks. I just gave you this explanation. So the ASPX file that you see on pages 475 and 477. So let's look here. So the code is presented here. The author has shaded the parts of the data source controls and the controls they're bound to. As the app again relies completely on data binding, there is no C# control. The first control is the drop-down list that's bound to the first data source control, which is SQL data source 1. The postback property is set to true, so the page is automatically posted back to the server when the user selects a category. The second one that's shown here down toward the bottom all right, that one is bound to the data list control. Finally, the last part of the chapter here, starting on page 478, how to use the advanced features of a SQL data source, the last four pages of the chapter. All right, the author says how to create a data source that can update a database. All right. What you want is you want this box to come up. Now, when you write a query, it'll actually write you have to write the select query. Okay? You have to write the select. If in your select query you add the primary key for the table, then when you go in, this box right here, that box will not be grayed out. If you delete the primary key from your query, this will be grayed out so you can't change it. But if you add the primary key to your query, you can check there, and that check writes this code for you. And if you make that check, it'll also do optimistic concurrency for you. And again, that's explained on 478 and 479. Okay. On 480, they say how to change the data source mode. What they're saying there is by default, again, unless told otherwise, this is set to data set. But if you set it to data reader, which is not the default, data set is, if you set it to data reader, it becomes read only, but it can only go in a forward direction, so you can't back up. All right? It's going to load faster, so you'll have better performance, but you have less control. All right? There's also some properties that you can set for caching. Remember, caching basically says I'm going to use a certain part of memory to hold information for me. All right, I have no idea if I'm going to have time to finish what I'm about to do here. Okay, I guess I've got that. But I'm going to stop here and see if I can do some of the exercises at the end of the chapter.